Hello, friends. Today I am joined by my friend, Katie Waalkes. Katie is a second generation homeschooler who is married to her high school sweetheart and the mother of 6 children. Having homeschooled for over a decade, Katie has a passion for tailoring education to each child's needs, especially given that several of her children have special needs. Katie shares her wisdom through her YouTube channel, Life in the Mundane, where she equips and encourages homeschooling moms with practical tips and encouragement to pursue what God has called them to do. And I've actually had Katie on the podcast before. So if you want to kind of like hear about some more general homeschool tips and encouragement, I will include that link in the show notes for this episode. But this is going to be a little bit of a different podcast episode. Katie and I both have experience homeschooling in the midst of medical needs, but we have kind of two different perspectives. Katie has been doing this for many years with chronic medical needs in her children. Whereas most of you guys know that our family had a sudden emergent kind of situation when Isaac was diagnosed with leukemia last year. So we thought, well, we'd have similar perspectives, but different as well. And we thought we would just sort of share our stories a little bit and some of the lessons we've learned in hopes it will be an encouragement for you guys. So, Katie, that was like a really super long introduction, but
You're good.
can you tell people a little bit about your family and just your sort of experience with homeschooling in general?
Yeah,
And then a little bit more niche down, also your experience homeschooling a child with medical needs.
absolutely. So, like I said in my intro with that, I am a second generation homeschooler. So I feel like I've been homeschooling my whole life. I fell in love with homeschooling as a kid. I knew that's what I wanted to do for my kids. And so we started out with that route, and that was the plan all along. With 6 kids now, I have ranging 15, 14, no, yeah, 15, 14, 13, 12, 8 and 7 years old. Nope, 7 and 6 years old. I know how old my kids are, maybe, most likely. Anyways, if I think about it hard enough. And with those age ranges, it's just been a lot of ups and downs. It's funny because when we started homeschooling, we very much started for the reason that most homeschoolers start homeschooling. They start homeschooling because they're like, oh, we want to ignite a love of learning and we want to be able to be a primary influence in our kids' lives. And all of that is still very, very true, but it has now become a literal necessity for at least my children with medical needs because of the scheduling, because of the flexibility required. I don't even understand how we would do what we are doing now if she was in a traditional school setting. So we have 6 kids. Like I said, multiple have special needs, and actually multiple have some level of medical needs, but our one daughter, Rachel, has the most medical needs. She has a She has a disorder called 22q 11.2 deletion syndrome, and that causes up to 180 different types of complications. And she has a huge handful of those. She just underwent her 22nd surgery, I believe, at 12 years old. And so we're no stranger to hospitals. We spend a lot of time there. She has hearing loss. She has feeding issues. We have GI issues, juvenile arthritis, all sorts of things that you can imagine. We've got a whole list of doctors. So we've been doing this for a long time when it comes to this, and it's really been a blessing to be able to homeschool and give her that flexibility of learning, but also prioritizing surviving, because that's been a huge part of her life.
I am so thankful to hear you say that because I think that was my experience over the past year as well. I was so thankful that we were already homeschooling when Isaac got his diagnosis with, 80 nights, over 80 nights in the hospital in that first year, innumerable other hospital visits, clinic visits, all the rest, plus all the days at home feeling
Yeah.
terrible, it literally not being safe to be in crowded public places for him because of immune issues. And I just thought to myself, what a gift it was to be able to homeschool, to be able to maintain some sort of sense of normalcy, routine, to still be learning in the midst of that really hard year. Of course, it looked very different than we anticipated, but I was so very thankful and was just thinking how difficult it would be for children who suddenly not only is like the health impacting their life, but their entire world of education is also kind of taken
Ah,
away. So,
for
yeah.
sure.
What have been some of the advantages that you have seen being able to homeschool in the midst of this sort of medical season?
I think the biggest one is probably flexibility. For sure. Learning happens, but it happens in pockets. And we have to take those pockets of time when everything aligns, like when everything it works out and we're like, we're feeling good and we're not at a doctor's appointment. We're not at the, we work things into each little crick and crevice of life. And if we didn't have that flexibility of that, if we had a strict structure of it has to be done this time to this time, most of the learning wouldn't be able to happen. So having that flexibility of scheduling, being able to take school with you to the doctor's office instead of having to take off. I mean, in August alone, she had 12 different specialists that she saw just in the month of August. And so it's like, how would you have done school with something like that unless you could bring it with you?
Yeah. And also, I just think about how we already were thinking about education in sort of an outside the box way. I know, especially as a fellow second generation homeschooler, right? We came in like, don't box me in, don't tell me what to do. So we already had this idea that education didn't have to look a certain way. It didn't have to look a certain traditional, like a traditional mold. And so I think as homeschoolers, if you are facing some sort of crisis, whether it be a long-term medical need or challenge, or a shorter-term medical need or challenge, or even just like a move, a new baby, a job change, those things that can feel a little bit like a crisis in the midst of them. Like you already have this perspective, this unique perspective as a homeschooler that so many things count as learning, right? We know that learning happens in an organic way. It happens outside the textbook, outside the worksheets. And so to be able to see that like really playing out in the lives
Yes,
of our children who are, otherwise would just be missing most of their school is really a gift.
absolutely.
While I know this is kind of a little bit of a dumb question, maybe, because there's a lot of challenges, it's just really hard to have a child dealing with really intense medical needs, health challenges. Um, so not all of them. What have been a few of the challenges you faced trying to homeschool in the midst of these chronic illnesses and long-term medical needs?
I was thinking about this and I was like, okay, there are a lot of challenges. Like, which one should I pick? I think probably the hardest challenge is the constant doubting yourself and constantly questioning, are they really too, like, by pushing them too hard? Are they too sick to do school today? But also, are we building bad habits? Or, kids are smart. Kids are very, 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 very smart. And they pick up very quickly on how to play the system. And so my daughter definitely with chronic illness and chronic pain with arthritis and all the other things, she's in pain every day. There's not a day that she's not in pain. So if we didn't homeschool on days that she was in pain, we would never be able to homeschool. So I'm constantly trying to judge how much can we handle today? And that's a really tricky thing to navigate because I know it's not going to end. There's not an end in sight, this side of heaven at least. And so because of that, it's just a lot of second guessing. I feel like when it comes as a mom of like, how hard do I push? And some days I push too hard and I realize it and I regret it. And other days I'm like, I think they were kind of working the system there. And like they really could have handled a little bit more. So like that's probably the hardest part is just the second guessing, which is, of course, what all homeschool moms do all the time, regardless of whether you have a medically complex kid, is our own like guilt complexes or second guessing our choices.
And it's so emotionally draining than us as mom, right? We talk about like decision fatigue, and it's almost this like constant decision where you're constantly like trying to calculate the calculus of just how bad does this child feel? How much of this is like an emotional issue? How much of this is physical? When do I push? When do I let it go? And I find that incredibly emotionally draining, like just exhausting.
Yes.
And it's not like something you can just decide one time and figure it out because it's always in flux.
Yeah, there's no formula. There's no like, well, if this, then that, because there's all these different factors that go into it. And then we've had doctors who have explained to us that one of the struggles that a lot of times happens, or one of the downsides that typically happens with kids who have chronic illnesses or something more severe, right? Like leukemia, is that you feel like crud, and then you want to just sleep, or you want to regress, or you want to pull away, and you just want to not do things. And like, yes, your body needs rest to some extent, but it can start craving it so much that it can cause more issues. So my daughter, who has arthritis, if she starts babying her joints and basically not using it and not moving, she'll start losing that mobility. And so they were like, she has to some extent, the best thing for her is to push through the pain to some extent. The best thing is to be like, oh, we're on a walk and you're tired. Let's take a few minutes. Let's take a break. But then we got to keep going. And I think it's such a good life lesson. I think it's taught me a lot as a homeschool mom of like, sometimes I'm like, I don't feel like it. I'm having a hard day. I was up late. I just want to kind of like call it quits. And I'm like, no, sometimes we need to push through the hard things, you know? And it's okay. And we don't want to build bad habits or get weak because we're constantly giving up. And so she's taught me a lot, just taking care of her and thinking through these things. But it is a hard thing to know when to push, when to not. And yeah, definitely emotionally tasked.
Yeah. Well, do you have any practical tips for kind of developing a flexible homeschool schedule that does accommodate those frequent medical appointments and the tests and hospital stays, fluctuating energy levels like we were talking about? How can we balance schoolwork, getting a lot accomplished as much as we can on the days when someone's feeling well, being able to pull back sort of practically? We've talked a little bit about the emotional aspect of that, the wisdom, discernment, parenting aspect, but practically, how do we arrange a flexible homeschool schedule?
So for all of my kids, I have a bare minimum. I have that like, hey, in order for this to be to get done, we need to get done. We need to at least touch on these three things, kind of thing. And I have that with her. My bare minimums look a little different with her because, we may truly not be able to get to something. If you're having surgery, she literally can't eat, for several hours prior to surgery. She's hungry, she's tired, she's sometimes nervous, she's going to be put under. It's a whole day event. There is no school that's going to happen that day. And we just call it quits, and that's fine. But again, if we took every day off that was hard, we would never do school. So for us, we have just learned that I want to consistently show up and do some kind of learning each day. It doesn't have to be related to a curriculum or textbook. Sometimes I'll gauge it even within like spelling lessons. Like we'll do a spelling lesson, but some days I'm like, all right, let's just look at the words we got wrong yesterday. And other days I'm like, let's teach new material. And like, we very much gauge it piece by piece. But I think one of the things that I would recommend most is have some stuff set aside that is semi easy for your child, that it like mentally is easy, that is not overwhelming, that on days where learning might be a little more difficult, whether it's because of physical or mental, emotional reasons, or just scheduling, that they can still be doing something to learn and review and to practice, but they're not working on the hardest material possible, and save the new learning and the new material or the harder concepts for those days when they're a little bit fresher. So you don't actually have to go sequentially, I guess is what I'm saying. Sometimes we'll have curriculum and we'll say, today we're going to pause from the curriculum and we're going to do this review game because I know this concept is easier for you. So I think that's one of the big things, is not just what are you going to do, but how are you going to work it into the day a little bit.
And I think that when you're planning your homeschool sort of more from a big picture perspective, which is how I like to approach homeschool planning, it makes it easier to be flexible in that way. So like last year, when we were really in some of the most intense parts of treatment, I would just say, okay, my big goal is for us to read something. I wanted Isaac to read something with his eyes every day. It was really hard, and he didn't want to do it for long periods of time. So I didn't even sometimes give a number of pages or even an amount of time. We were just going to do some reading, going to do a little bit of math, and have our morning time together. And that enabled it to be really flexible, where it kept enough of a framework where he knew, okay, these are the things mom is still expecting me to do, even if I'm in a bad state today or whatever. But it gave me the ability to really flex that as far as like how much time were we really going to do it? Or like you were saying with math, it didn't necessarily mean we were going to learn a new lesson. I had some like easier review worksheets that were just reinforcing, concepts he already knew. And I could use that as an easier math day if he needed rest, or even just taking a lesson. Like you don't have to do the whole thing.
Yes,
You
yes, we
can do half of it. You can do a third of it. Like break it up, stretch it out. You have time. There's no race. Like we're not in a race anytime in our homeschool, but especially not when you're talking about a kid with medical needs.
Yeah. I think the other thing is making good use of screen time. I was going to say you just need to get used to the fact that screen time is probably going to be a reality. I'm sure there are awesome, amazing medical mamas out there that are rocking it without screens. And to you, hats off. You're incredible. But with the amount that we are in doctors' offices and things, there is more screen time than we typically have ever had for any of our kids. And so we try to be really, really conscious of how we use screens. We actually, for just her, have a subscription to IXL. We just have it for like the math and language arts. But what's nice about it is it's an app that goes in and it doesn't put your child at a grade level. It just gives them an assessment to see where they're at. And it just gives them concepts in either math or language arts that they're a little bit weaker in and that they can kind of work on and improve on. And they have easier ones and harder ones. And she can kind of choose that. So sometimes when we travel, because that's the other aspect of our school that makes it hard, is we travel about 3 hours away one way to go to our children's hospital that we're going to all these appointments for. So that makes everything take longer as well. So she's able to take that to the doctor's office and do that instead of me having to lug a bunch of books and things like that. So having good educational apps, huge plus. Audiobooks, if you're going to have screen time, audiobooks is a great way to use screen time. We have certain educational like YouTube channels that we really, really love, or podcasts that we love. But I think having a list of that ahead of time is really helpful. Instead of trying to find stuff on the fly, you can do that, but you already have so many decisions that you're dealing with when you're in this situation. It's easier if, apart from the situation, you can do some research. And I know Amy's got great lists for that. I have a few YouTube videos on different apps and podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that. So there are a lot of great resources out there, but I think having kind of a pre-built list that you could pick from is much more helpful than trying to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah, definitely. I'll too just share piggybacking off of the screen time discussion. Yeah, my kids have watched way more screen time this year than I would judge myself so hard like 5 years ago, Amy. But one thing that was helpful when we were having some extended, longer hospital stays, like several weeks in a row, I really did try to still have, okay, in the morning, we were going to hold off on those screens and still like, I just sort of made an arbitrary rule, like no screens until after lunch, which because it wasn't a specific time enabled me to be flexible too in the hospital, but it's so easy when a child is sad and they're not feeling well and you're just stuck in a hospital bed for weeks on end. It gets really easy to just sort of numb the mind and just not want to do anything except being on the screen. So I did try to be purposeful where it was after lunch and in the morning, that was when we were playing games, when we were reading aloud, doing other things. And so just kind of picking our arbitrary rule helped with that. Which is different than when we're going in and just having a really intense clinic day with chemo and spinal taps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Pretty much on those days when it's like a short term and it's really a miserable experience, I'm like, dude, you can watch as much as you want.
Whatever you want. Yeah. That's exactly what we do for a doctor's appointment. Like when we go for them, my daughter has pretty severe ADHD and loves to interject incessantly. And I love that about her. But when you're trying to talk to doctors about a lot of heavy things, it's very overwhelming and sometimes can add to some confusion. So I let her have that screen time and she stays a little quieter during that process and it makes things a little bit easier. And I admit it's something for the convenience of it. But yes, same thing. So when we were in the hospital, she had a 10-day hospital stay back in June when she was getting her feeding tube. And we didn't do the exact like time rule, but what we did is we had a checklist and I said, okay, you have to read something, you have to create something, you have to, we had to do some kind of Bible, something like we just had a checklist of things. And those things depending on how she was feeling or doing, I could make really, really short. Or if she was doing better that day, I could make them very, very long. And I'd be like, okay, well, we're going to do this whole craft and we're going to take advantage of this. I will say hospitals have amazing programs. Most hospitals now have amazing child life specialists. So taking advantage of those child life specialists and asking, our hospital even has a library that the kids can check out books from. So when she was feeling good enough, we would go down to the library. And when she wasn't feeling good, I would go down to the library for her and I would pick out a new book for the day. And we would read through an entire book in a day all throughout the day. So, like there's just all sorts of fun things that you can do. But I definitely recommend, like Amy said, to really try to kind of monitor that because it messes with everybody's emotional and mental health. And it honestly makes the days very long, very long.
Yeah. Well, what are some ways that we can support the emotional and social needs of these children as well? Of course, there's the academic side, but then there's also the interactions with peers or just it's impacting their emotions. And it's harder for them because they're kids. It's already hard for them to gauge their own emotions. Do you have any strategies or tips for that?
Yeah. So one thing we started doing early on was we started talking about the difference between our feelings and truth and really examining those differences, understanding that our feelings can be kind of a barometer for where our heart is at, but that doesn't necessarily mean our heart is focusing on truth. So we might be feeling very grumpy because of our pain level, but the truth is we're not allowed to be grumpy just because we feel grumpy, right? And so we can focus on the fact that God can help us be patient. We can focus on the fact that this pain is not going to last forever, and that's something we focus on a lot in our house. We talk a lot about heaven. We talk about eternity and no more pain and no more tears and no more sorrow. And we're like, but on this side of heaven, that's a reality we have to deal with as a result of sin. And so it's something that we talk through a lot about truths and feelings and how they relate. I actually ended up creating a printable pack that I use with my kids. We do a morning menu instead of morning time. And we have a whole page full of feelings and a whole page full of truths. And every single morning, my kids identify what they're feeling that morning and then what truth goes with it. And my little ones, my 6 and 7-year-olds, those truths and those feelings don't really match up. They just pick a feeling and they pick a truth. And it drives my older kids nuts because they're like, you're supposed to pick ones and how they correlate. And I'm like, but that's a more advanced skill. And I said, I don't care if they're just picking a truth and a feeling because they're learning what those truths are. So in the future, when they're this is something that comes up a lot is the sibling interaction and sometimes jealousy or frustration or envy or whatever that comes up. One of the truths on that sheet is God put me in this family for a reason. And so my kids are like, I'm feeling really frustrated this morning, but God put me in this family for a reason. And I'm going to focus on that.
That's really excellent. Please send me after we're done. Make sure you send me the link to that or any of your other sources that you've mentioned. I'll put those in the show notes. One of the things we've talked to Isaac about is kind of joking around a little bit because keeping a sense of humor is really important.
Yes.
And so I'll tell him, I'll say, just because you have cancer doesn't mean you get to yell at your siblings, or just because you have cancer, you still have to obey mommy. Kind of teasing him a little bit, of course, choosing when to do that appropriately. But it is that thing where we want to be patient with our children and long suffering, treating them the way God treats us, right? Not as our sins deserve. So being so patient and gracious and kind to our children who are dealing with great physical and emotional discomfort often, while also, like you were saying, reminding them there are still external truths that we all have to submit to regardless of our circumstances. Absolutely. I will say with the social aspect, it was sometimes tricky. I would imagine it's super tricky for you guys because your hospital is so far away. But for actual hospitalizations, it was hard for us at times because of Isaac being immunocompromised. Mm-hmm. But there were times where we had friends who were able to come in and visit in the hospital, and sometimes they would stay for very short periods of time, and that meant a lot. So if you have a child who is able safely to visit, don't be afraid to ask your friends. They may not offer it because they may not want to pressure, or they may not know like what's allowed or isn't allowed. So I would just say, don't be afraid to ask. And I think it's really a blessing for the other children too. I've seen just the young guys in Isaac's life just be incredible friends for such small children, I guess not very small. They would hate to hear me call them small, very grown up young men. But just to see their compassion and their love for Isaac, when he can't play in the way that normally, little boys would play with one another, I think has been a gift for them. It's certainly been a gift for Isaac. So I would just say, don't be afraid to ask, even if your child can't play in a typical way or the way they typically have in the past. There could be creative ways to still maintain those friendships. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are visiting someone in the hospital, especially if it's been a long hospital stay, something that means the world, I'm going to speak for myself. I think this would apply to Amy as well. But something that means the world's to the moms is when you text ahead of time and ask if they want you to pick up a meal that's not from the hospital. Because hospital food is gross and expensive. And I cannot tell you how many times I had people who were like, hey, I'm coming by. Do you want me to bring you Chipotle? I'm like, please, I will love you forever.
Yes.
Please do not make me a hospital hamburger one more time.
Yeah. We had many people supply Isaac with Chick-fil-A fries, which for a period of several weeks was literally the only thing we could get him to eat in the hospital. So, well,
but
I know. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, no, it is true that like socially it can be really challenging. And I think one of the things we've found is because we like, unlike you guys where you're like in a season and it's kind of the same thing, it does very much fluctuate. We've had seasons where when Rachel was born, she was a bubble baby. She couldn't go out. We had to alternate taking her to church, which I know you understand that whole process, not taking her to church, sorry, taking the other kids to church while one of us stayed home with her, and not being able to take her out in public, things like that, to seasons where it wasn't that big a deal, and then back and forth. It's a whole roller coaster over here. And so one of the things we found is digital connection points. In person's always best, but when you can't have in person, Zoom calls with your friends is a huge thing. Like it just totally lifts their heart. It's such a special thing. We have friends that have gotten on calls with her when she's at the hospital and they've played like a scavenger hunt, or they've done like around the room to see what they can find something blue, and then they'll show it to each other or whatever. Or like calling them and making a craft. They sent a craft kit to us, and the other kid has a craft kit and they're making their crafts together. And so there are a lot of fun things that you can do. We also have really worked to make sure that her social opportunities, I kind of hate saying that as a second generation homeschooler, anytime I have to deal with the socialization question, I kind of like cringe. But one of the things that we have dealt with is we have made sure to make commitments that are more singular versus long-term. So she doesn't do sports because I know we would have to miss so many of those opportunities, but we have done obviously church things or co-ops that are very flexible and allow us to flex in or out as needed, and whatnot. So I think there are still tons of opportunities to have your kids involved and plugged in. It just takes some serious intentionality on the parents' part, and then also on the friends' part. And like, that's what you were saying, Amy, of like looking at how can I still be a friend to this kid? Because guess what? More than ever, they need your friendship when they're going through all of this stuff. I think it's easy for people to be like, well, I don't want to bother them. They're busy with medical things. And we're like, yeah, we're busy, but our kid is still a kid and they still want connection.
Yeah, definitely. Well, okay. I feel like I have all these other things I want to say and like suggestions. I could relate to that, but that might need to be, maybe I should do a blog post about that. Ways you can support children.
That would be a really good blog post.
But I will try to move on so that we don't get too sidetracked but I know that your children in particular, actually more than one of your children, deal with chronic pain and actual physical limitations. Isaac has had some, obviously he's dealt with pain and discomfort, but for the most part, we're now kind of coming out of a season. He's able to be more mobile, and it hasn't dramatically impacted his ability to do school or ordinary daily activities. But when you are dealing with a child who has some of those physical limitations, what are some ways you can adapt the curriculum, work with them to to enable them to still do what they need to do to learn, but in a way that meets their physical needs.
Absolutely. So, like I mentioned before, so my daughter that I've been talking about has juvenile arthritis, but then I have another daughter that has an undiagnosed disorder that is causing severe joint pain. And both of them, we make accommodations when needed for writing, because physically handwriting is painful and can be very fatiguing very quickly. So we offer speech to text as an option that my kids can take advantage of to write their papers. And people think it's cheating or whatever. I don't know if you've ever used speech to text. I actually think it's way harder because you have to then go back and make sure it actually wrote the word you said and add the punctuation, and there's a whole process to that, but it is something that has been helpful, especially for my daughter who's in middle school, to be able to complete her papers that way. We also, when they're younger, we have done where they've dictated to us. And so if there is something that needs to be written, they'll tell me what the answer is and I will write it down. So we offer some flexibility as far as that goes. We've also offered flexibility. We've worked really closely with an occupational therapist, which I highly recommend if your children have any kind of pain or whatnot, because not only can they teach you how to make adaptations in your homeschool, so things like we oftentimes as homeschooling parents think that little hands mean they need little tools, right? They need little pencils, they need little whatever, but actually fatter, wider pencils is actually better for their joints and like less painful. And so they were like going out and getting larger crayons or larger pencils is helpful, or adding a grip, pencil grip or whatever. So they were able to teach us those kind of adaptations that I would have had no idea otherwise on what to do. And then obviously, again, just kind of modifying the length of lessons on what we can handle pain wise and whatnot. And also asking the child to like, hey, would a break be good right now? Like sometimes you just need to take a break, or we need to change the order. So we don't do two heavy writing activities back to back. We'll do like a writing activity and then I'll read aloud to them. And then we might do another writing activity. So we kind of alternate those things as well. You just have to be a little more intentional with everything.
Yeah. I think it's so important for moms to hear that working with your child and adapting to their needs, enabling them to do the work, but maybe in a way that doesn't look typical, or maybe they're not even the one holding the pen or whatever, that is not cheating. That is an incredibly wonderful tool that we have for our children, whether they have long-term physical limitations or not, right? Sometimes even just a young child might grow very weary. They might get tired. Maybe they're able to process information at a higher level than they're able to actually physically write it out. And so don't be afraid to help your child in that way. I always bring up, Milton, who's like blind and dictating Paradise Lost, and we don't say, oh, he didn't really write it.
Yeah,
Of course he
exactly.
did.
I say
So it still counts.
Hal and Melanie Young, I heard them speak at a conference a couple years ago, and they explained it perfectly to me. They were like, the idea is we hold the bar for the academic standard for our children, and then we give them every tool necessary to help them reach that bar. So we don't lower it for them. We just equip them with as many tools as they need. So I have a child who has severe dyslexia, and he uses a program where he can take a picture of any of his textbooks and it reads it to him. He's in high school. We've done tons of reading instruction, and he follows along there to make sure he understands the material. And that's not cheating. He is still reading the exact same books that his brother who's in high school is reading. He's still doing the exact same material. We've just given him the tools to be able to reach that bar. And that kind of opened my eyes a lot when it came to this, of like, okay, we're still going to learn all the same things, but we're going to take it at the pace our child needs, and we're going to give them the tools they need to be able to do it with the limitations they have.
I love that. And that actually segues perfectly into my next question. Because when we think about this idea of holding, our children to a certain academic standard, like we have the bar we want them to reach. And then we're faced with maybe an extended period of time where they haven't been able to do their schoolwork, or they're not meeting those benchmarks we had set. Maybe they're not making it to grade level in a certain subject, or all the subjects. How ought we to adjust our goals, maybe for a year, or long-term goals for a child based on the realities of the situation? Or should we try to like catch up? How do you handle that in your family?
So first of all, as far as long-term goals, I keep them character driven and not academic driven. I have no academic long-term goals for my daughter specifically. There are so many medical and cognitive needs. And with her particular genetic disorder, kids can grow up to be adults and function fully on their own and be able to have jobs and driver's licenses and all those things. But also a huge portion of the kids do not. And she could very much end up living with us for the rest of her life. It's just a very big unknown. And so I try not to have major overarching academic goals other than being able to ideally read with her eyes, which I think we'll be able to do, but to read and understand scripture and whatnot. But everything is more spiritual and character driven goals when it comes to long-term goals. With academic goals, it doesn't mean I don't have them. I just do them monthly is what I do. And so I look at the month ahead and I assess what kind of doctor's appointments are coming up or surgeries. I look at what season it is. There are certain seasons where we just end up sicker all the time. She has a compromised immune system. So we know that, there's certain seasons that are going to be rougher. And so I will look at that month ahead and realistically go, okay, I think we can get here in this month. And then at the end of the month, I wrote down where she got. And sometimes it's there, sometimes it's way far away from there, and other times she surpasses it. And then I use that kind of how far we got to help me make the goals for the next month. And so I very much take it month by month. I don't, with her in particular, just because of the severity of medical needs and the fact that this is a long game, not a short game, is that we're just like forward motion, progress. Progress, not perfection, is what gets said in my house 24/7. And we're just moving one step forward. And so we don't double up with her in particular. I have a few kids that I'll do that for if they can handle it. But for a child who is medically needy, I think if you're trying to make up time or if you're going through a shorter stint of something, right, and it's chronic or long-term, I would recommend extending your school year rather than doubling up. So we school year round, and we have ever since she was born, because we just need that flexibility of when there's a day off, I don't need to stress about it, and I don't have to make it up because I know we have way more than the days required in our state.
For our family, because Isaac was diagnosed in 3rd grade and will complete treatment by the end of 5th grade. So it's terrible to, of course, receive a cancer diagnosis anytime, but I am thankful it is in that period. I think it would be more challenging, possibly academically, middle school or high school.
Yes.
And so I think with the elementary years in particular, the main things you're focusing on there are like math and reading, right? Those are the main skills that you need to deepen. Everything else you really can learn much more quickly later on. Catch up, if that's kind of an awkward term to use. Maybe we don't like hearing that term, but like anything that you were intending to learn, you're going to be able to learn more quickly later on. And so that was what I just really prioritized. That's why I prioritized trying to keep that up through last year. And then, like you were saying, normally we are take a big break in the summer people, but I knew we just needed to do a little bit through the summer for him. So he was set up for success this year in 4th grade. And so that worked out well. And I do think sometimes we worry so much about hitting certain milestones. But I think a lot of times they will just sort of go through these jumps too, barring any other external cognitive challenges. I've seen that with my kids where you think they're never going to get this concept. And then the next week, suddenly they get it. I've seen that with like teaching my kids to read. You're like, they're never going to put it together. And then suddenly they're blending sounds. So just not to be like, don't look at one day or 1 week or even a semester that you feel like this was a big waste. Like just keep plotting, slow and steady progress. And it'll
and a 10, 20-minute lesson consistently every day is worth a lot more than 2 1-hour lessons in a week. You know what I mean? It's helpful to be short and sweet and to the point and just kind of touch on it and keep that tortoise and hare concept of just like, all right, just let's keep plugging along. So it can be hard, and there are moments where it definitely can be discouraging, or you can worry, am I preparing them enough? Because while for this daughter, we're not sure what the future holds with that. I have another daughter that does have chronic pain and has very clear goals of what she wants. So helping her meet those goals is a top priority for me. And so I think it's very much working with your child, just like in everything. It's very individualized, and we need to come alongside them and say, okay, what are you interested in? What do you feel like God's calling you to do? And my job is to equip you for that as much as I possibly can and help set you up. But God is the one that ultimately makes you successful in that, or closes that door. And so I don't ever want to hold any of my kids back or push them way too far forward. So we're constantly just constant in prayer and consideration every single day.
Well, mom is going through a lot while our kids are going through a lot. So do you have, I don't actually have anything to say about this because I just don't do a very good job at it. But here's the question, Katie, maybe you figured this one out. How do we prioritize our own emotional and spiritual health while also seeking to be faithful caregivers, educators, and also like wives and moms to other
Right,
kids,
all the things.
all those other things. Yeah.
Exactly. As far as how to prioritize, again, lots of prayer, because there's not a formula at all. I think things that have been helpful, not required, but helpful, is to actually step away. If you have a spouse or a family member or something that can do some respite type care and step in for even an hour, even 20 minutes sometimes, and being able to physically remove yourself from the situation and be off caregiver duty for a little bit, it can really help. I also think it's important what you do with that time. So taking that time to get into God's word, taking that time to cry, taking that time to eat something, maybe shower, we can mix it up a little bit. It's very helpful. My older ones are teens, and so I'm able to leave them at home. And so sometimes I will just leave in the middle of the day for lunch hour. I'm like, I will be back. Mom is going to go run through a drive-through and sit in the car and ugly cry and pray and eat something. And then I come back and it's like a whole fresh perspective. So all that to say, it sounds like my tip is to run away. It might be a little bit, but run to God, right? Like not run away from our families, run to God, step away for a moment, gain some perspective. Definitely focusing on things to be thankful for in the season. It's really easy to become completely consumed with fear and anxiety and overwhelm. And so taking that time to write down every single day, at least one thing that you're thankful for. And something I challenge my kids in is to say something they're thankful for and not to repeat it ever again. No, not that you can't repeat being thankful for that, but challenge yourself to find something new to be thankful for each and every day. And that is, it's not easy after a couple of years of doing this, but it is a really good exercise that has helped kind of keep me grounded.
I think it's been helpful for me to realize it also counts when I'm singing psalm with the kids. It counts when I'm reading scripture with my children or family devotions. These are all ways that I am able to focus on truth, going back to the first part of our conversation, what's really true, God's truth. Even if I don't have maybe the emotional or mental or time like wherewithal to do my own, intense Bible study or something like that. Like it still counts when we're reading scripture with our families as well.
And having people in your life who you could ask to intercede on your behalf, and being like, hey, I am struggling right now. I am struggling mentally, spiritually, physically. Like I need prayer warriors to come alongside me and to pray for me. Asking your husband, asking friends at church, asking people in your community, I think is incredibly important and valuable.
We don't have to try to act like we have it all together.
No, Amy and I regularly ugly cry and call each other crying. And like, it's just the thing. Like you find somebody that you can do that with. It is very helpful and beneficial.
Everyone needs a friend they can ugly cry with. Well, speaking of emotional challenges, the siblings of children with medical needs may not be the ones actually in pain or undergoing treatment. But it is every bit as traumatic for them to be walking through and alongside a sibling. It's really hard. I think that's one of the hardest things for me is feeling like guilt over the time I'm not spending with the older children or the attention that they're not getting because I have to focus on the treatment for their brother. That's really hard. That's hard just in general as a parent, but then you add on like we're also responsible to still educate them, right? And it's not fair to them to like not get educated because we're distracted. So how do you deal with that? Or what are some ways that you're able to really, I guess, one, deal with the own mom guilt, and then two, actively be a good homeschool parent to the siblings?
So there are sort of three things that I do. I'm going to touch on it briefly, but basically, one is to outsource when you can for siblings, and that could be using a curriculum that teaches for them and grades for them and things like that to make sure that they're getting that consistency and teaching and that they're getting that immediate feedback. Because the problem is, even when mom's grading stuff, if they're holding off and you can't get to it for 2 weeks, and then they've been doing this math concept for 2 weeks incorrectly, and now it's this habit that they're going to wrestle with, I think finding some ways to give yourself some grace and give some wiggle room, but to make sure they're consistently getting a good education is helpful. We found a lot of incredible online classes because my fear with outsourcing was like, if I put them in co-op classes or like whatever classes out there, then all of a sudden that's another place I have to take them to. And what happens when I'm in the hospital and I can't take them? I don't have licensed drivers yet. And so having online resources was great for that. So that was one thing. I think the other thing is reminding yourself of that truth. God did not make a mistake when he put that child in your family for a reason. And he didn't make a mistake when those siblings were assigned to that child either. And so I have to remind myself constantly when I'm like, oh, they're being kind of put on the back burner again, or, oh, this struggle is happening, or it's really hard. Like my daughter has some pretty severe breakdowns and mental days that are not pretty, and everybody suffers on those days and has to come alongside. But you know what? My kids are some of the most compassionate, caring, gracious kids. They get annoyed with their sister. Like, don't let me paint this picture wrong. There are days where they would be happy to step away and take a break, but they are so loving and caring in a way that I could have never taught them that had they not gone through this and experienced this. They're very protective of her. And so I constantly remind myself and them that God didn't make a mistake when he made this arrangement. And so we don't need to sit in that guilt. We need to make the most of what God's called us to do. And then the third thing, and I know this is going to sound, I've tried to think about how to phrase this about sound bad, but let's just say it, don't cancel me or come for me. But sometimes we might choose, depending on the situation, especially in a chronic situation where there is no end in sight, to delay or to delay treatment or a therapy or something for the better of other children in your home. And now let me clarify that before you come for me. I'm not talking life-saving medical treatments. I am not saying in a cancer situation that we don't do chemo, like obviously. But somebody came to me and told me this when Rachel was probably 4, and it shook me to my core. But I was like, I'm overwhelmed. I'm stressed. I don't feel like I'm giving my other kids enough attention. She's in speech therapy twice a week. She's in occupational therapy twice a week. She has all these doctor's appointments. At that time, we were doing 10 to 12 doctor's appointments per week, every single week. And I had a 4-year-old, she would have been 4. So a 4, a 5, a 6, and a 7-year-old is what I had at the time. And I just was overwhelmed. And she was like, you know what, Katie? She's like, this is a long-term game. She's like, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And she's like, there are times where we prioritize our sick child's health, and our other kids suffer a little bit because of the commitments for that. It's okay to sometimes prioritize the other kid's mental health and say, you know what, we're going to take the summer off of therapy. Like, I'm all for early intervention. I'm not saying delay therapy completely, but it's okay to take a break. So this friend would take cold and flu season off of therapies every year. And she was like, that way my immunosuppressant kid wouldn't have to worry about getting sick. And they just took that season. So we don't do that all the time. We're there. We have therapies all the time around here. That's just what we do. But we have taken seasons where we're like, hey, the needs of someone else in the family, it needs to become the priority right now. And so that sounds really weird. And I don't know, hopefully you hear my heart behind that, but I want to let you know that it's okay if you need to press pause on something, because we do it with our other kids all the time. It just feels more significant when it's your medical kid.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful for moms to hear. And it is going to be so individualized in any given season. Like with my older kids last year when we were in the hospital so much, there were literal like months at a time where John and I were not both home with our children for like extended periods of time. That's really hard on a family. That's hard on your teens and tweens who they need mom and dad too, right? Relationship time. So academically, we simplified our academic requirements quite a bit in order to prioritize when there was time. Mom came home, she took a quick shower, threw in a little laundry. I'm not actually going to go sit there and do your math with you, but I will sit and cuddle and like watch a show or read a book with you. Just that was so much more valuable at that time. Now that we are not quite in that same season, thankfully we are not in the hospital all the time. We're stepping back up and no, now actually you are going to have more academic requirements again, back a little bit more to our normal-ish routine. Or even like with video calls, like I would take my teacher book to the hospital and sit there and be on a video call with my daughter and help her with her Latin because she was just having a really hard time doing it on her own. And so I was like, you know what? I can do that with you over video and that'll be fine. It gave us like a little touch point in the day, kind of a little funny to randomly be, you know,
Yes.
doing Latin in the hospital. But there's many creative ways we can still let our children know they're loved and we care for them and also make sure they are getting the academic instruction they need as well.
Absolutely.
Well, this was a lovely conversation. I feel like we could keep talking. I mean, we do. We talk on Marco about this stuff all the time, but so that it's not too unwieldy of an episode, I'll go ahead and draw us to a close here. But I do want to ask you the questions I'm asking all my guests this season. So the first is, what are you personally reading lately?
So I'm currently rereading The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert by Rosaria Butterfield. I read it 10, 11 years ago, totally changed my life, was an amazing book. And our church is doing it for a book club. And so we are rereading through it and I'm just like taking pages and pages of notes. And it's just such a phenomenal book. I want to leave you with like one thing that I've learned from this book though, like for people to listen or to think about. In her book, she describes, or she asks the question, I guess, she says, if you were the only person that someone came into contact with, if you were the only reference point they had about God and who he is, like, would they be convinced that he exists? Would they be convinced? And I was just like, wow, that hit me like a ton of bricks. If you don't know her story, you should definitely check it out. She has an insanely amazing testimony and how God has used her for sure.
Yeah. Oh, that is a fantastic book and such a convicting, but also exciting lesson
Yes.
to
Yes.
take forward. Yeah. The final question is almost, I thought, well, I could just leave this off because we've kind of been talking about dealing with a hard homeschool season this entire episode. But what would be your best tip for dealing with a homeschool day that seems to be going off the rails?
Keeping things short, shorten things up, have those bare minimums. You can pivot pretty easily. But my biggest tip is to leave the homeschool day on a positive note. So I don't care if it's like, everyone's crying, everyone's upset. We'll go do quiet time for like an hour so everybody can have like a timeout, and then we'll come back together and I'll do like one chapter and read aloud, or we will all come together and watch a YouTube video or a documentary or something fun, like just leaving it on some kind of positive note. Because what I have found over all the years of homeschooling through very hard seasons is when you leave a homeschool day and everybody's upset and there's tears and frustration, whatever, it is 10 times harder to return the next day to homeschooling. And if you miss several days in a row because it's been hard or because of other reasons, and you left it on a negative point, it can be really hard to come back to it. So I think that's always the thing. It's just take the last subject outside, go for a walk, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. The idea is just to leave on some kind of positive note, and then you can start back fresh. New mercies in the morning, right?
Yeah, that is such a great tip. I don't think I've ever heard someone say it that way, but I'm going to take that to heart because sometimes I get to the end of the day, it was hard. Everybody's crying. I'm like, fine, we're done. Everybody just go to
Forget it.
your
Yes.
rooms. But
So
that's
I'll say,
not like a good way to end it.
I'll say, forget it. Everyone go to your corners, and we're going to come back out. One more thing, like just one more thing.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And end with a smile.
Yes.
Katie, where can people find you all around the internet?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook at Life in the Mundane. I do have a website that has some free printables, including one of those emotion charts, truths for kids, prayer things for kids, and that's lifethemundane.com. And then finally, of course, you can find me in the Made to Homeschool community, Amy and I's homeschool community. We're doing regular workshops and hangouts, and we get to talk live all the time, as well as a bunch of resources that I put there as well.
Yeah, and I will have links to all of those things in the show notes for this episode at humilityandoxology.com. I would love it if you would take a minute to leave a rating and review for the podcast. If you're listening, make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel if you're watching the video. And then if you know someone who is going through a hard season in their homeschool, would you take the time to share this episode with them? We really want this to be an encouragement to other homeschool moms that you know you're not alone, that God is there with you in the midst of these difficult homeschool days. And I know both Katie and I would love to chat with you, here in the comments, or send us a DM, or pop into Me to Homeschool, join us live there. But we really do just pray that this was an encouragement and a blessing to you. And I will be talking with you, I'm sure, very soon again.
Thank you for having me again.